Oh my. Oh me. Oh my. Look at that. Oh, they're crushing it out here. They're crushing it out here with the rain. Look at that. It's crushing it. Crushing it. Live report of rain in Irvine, California, Woodbridge and nearby. Look, there's a what is it? Chenyi Investment over there. Anyway, it's not a good day. It's not a good day to build a snowman. They say that the worst days to build a snowman is when it's raining, and possibly when it's hot. But do you want to build a snowman? Come on, let's go and play. Oh, Frozen. Don't tell me that I don't bring the Disney. So we've got the Disney. We've also got intentional robots. We do not have Chat GPT because we couldn't get one of those. Anyway. So again, big shout out to Segerstrom of the Arts, as I do often. Oh man. Some of those drops are so big, I almost felt like I was in Scotland again. But luckily no hail, otherwise I'd have to bring the car inside where there'd be big dings on the outside of the vehicle. You can't do that in Scotland. In Scotland, the hail is strong with that one. So let's talk about who's who. We've got the last who's who bits and pieces. And then we're gonna jump into the donors that live in the box, or that donate to the box. Anyway, where did we get to? I think it was, did we get to Patricia L. Grab, stage manager, Broadway, The Cripple of Inishman, Film Newsies Tours, Anastasia, Newsies A, Christmas Story, Mary Poppins, We Will Rock You. I think that's a famous song. We will rock you. Young Frankenstein, 101 Dalmatians, Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, Cats, Miss Saigon, Swing Japan Regional, Here Lies Love, Seattle Rep, and BFA Stage Management, Penn State University. So Theron Alexander, Assistant Stage Manager, Broadway Summer, The Donna Summer Musical, National Tours, A Bronx Tale, the musical, First National, Off-Broadway, Jersey Boys, Little Rock Regional, The Outsider, I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change, Curvy Widow, Bad Jews. By the way, I really enjoyed the Jersey Boys. I want to watch that at some point, and the music was fantastic. Anyway, Bray Singleton, Assistant Stage Manager, Broadway Allegiance, The Cripple of Inishman, Tour, Aladdin, Something Rotten, Newsies, A Christmas Story, Off-Broadway, The Ruins of Civilization, Tales from Red Vienna, MTC, Regional Romeo and Juliet, Private Lives, Hartford Stage, Crowns, The Good Man, BFA in Stage Management from the Theater School of DePaul University. Then we've got Nero Tour, Physical Therapy, Carolyn Lawson, PT, founder and CEO. NT is the leader in performing arts and entertainment medicine. We are honored to be part of this touring production of Frozen. And then the last bit is Disney Theatrical Productions, DTP. A division of the Walt Disney Studio was formed in 1994 and operates under the direction of Thomas Schumacher, which is not to be confused with the famous driver. Worldwide, its 10 Broadway titles have been seen by more than 200 million theatergoers and have been nominated for 62 Tony Awards, winning Broadway highest honor 20 times. The company inaugural production Beauty and the Beast opened in 1994. It played a remarkable 13-year run on Broadway and has been produced worldwide. A brand new production of Beauty and the Beast, reimagined by members of original Broadway creative team led by Matt West, is currently on tour throughout the UK and Ireland. In November 1997, Disney made theatrical history with the opening of The Lion King, which received 6 1998 Tony Awards, including Best Musical and Best Director. Julie Taymor, who became the first woman in Broadway history to win the award. But apparently on here they got it wrong because it says win the award, which is why we shouldn't have teleprompters because people can put stuff in there that isn't amazing. Anyway, Julie Taymor, surpassing 25th landmark years on Broadway. It has welcomed 110 million visitors worldwide to date and has 9 productions currently running worldwide. The Lion King has played over 100 cities in 24 countries on every continent except Antarctica. Let's get one in Antarctica right away. Its worldwide gross exceeds that of any film, Broadway show, or entertainment title in box office today. It's kind of gross. It is. Anyway, let's talk about Elton John. Elton John, we all love Elton John. Tim Rice's Ada opened on Broadway next, winning 4 2000 Tony Awards. It was followed by Mary Poppins, a co-production with Cameron Mackintosh, which opened in London in 2004 and went on to enjoy a 6-year Tony-winning Broadway run. The show continues its Olivier Award-winning London return at its original home, the Prince Edward Theatre Tarzan, which opened on Broadway in 2006, went on to become an international hit with an award-winning production, enjoying a 10-year run in Germany. In January 2008, The Little Mermaid opened on Broadway and was the best-selling new musical of that year. DTP opened 2 critically acclaimed productions on Broadway in 2012, receiving 7 Tony Awards between them. Peter and the Star Catcher and Newsies, each of which enjoyed a 2-year run and launched North America tours, with Newsies playing a record-breaking Fathom events in cinema release. Aladdin, Disney Theatrical's 2014 hit, continues its smash Broadway run. It has launched 11 productions around the globe and been seen by more than 14 million guests. Its newest hit, the 2018 Tony-nominated Best Musical Frozen, currently has 5 productions around the world: the North American tour, Australia, Japan, London, and Hamburg. Other successful stage ventures have included the Olivier-nominated London hit Shakespeare in Love, stage productions of Disney's High School Musical, Der Glockner von Notre Dame in Berlin, and King David in concert. DTP has collaborated with the nation's preeminent theaters to develop new stage musicals, including The Jungle Book, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Freaky Friday, and Hercules. As a part of the recent acquisition of 21st Century Fox, DTP also heads the Buena Vista theatrical banner, which licenses Fox titles for stage adaptations, including Anastasia, Moulin Rouge, the musical Mrs. Doubtfire, The Devil Wears Prada. With 24 productions currently produced or licensed, a Disney musical is being performed professionally somewhere on the planet virtually every hour of the day. Would you like a hamburger? Maybe you would. Anyway, so Mean Girls, Hairspray, Chicago 6, Tina and Tina Turner musical, The Book of Mormon, American Ballet Theater, ABT, Like Water for Chocolates, and then we're going to go find out those donors. Now, I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for talking about donors, but I just don't give a crap. So I am going to read a list of donors. I will not read the numbers that the donors contributed because, unfortunately, I am not able to read numbers that range that high. But anyway, it says, Segerstrom Center of the Arts is enormously grateful for the support from the donors listed on the following pages. Your generosity empowers the center to provide dynamic performances and artistic education programs for all of Orange County. You allow us to continue our promise to become an exclusive cultural resource for our entire community. Thank you. So then cumulative given and receiving and more giving and more receiving. Segerstrom Center for the Arts is deeply grateful to the following donors who have provided extraordinary support during their lifetime. So Anonymous, of course, is someone we don't know. We've got Angels of the Arts. We've got Julia and George Argyros Family Foundation, Audrey Steele Burnand, Sandy Segerstrom Daniels, William J. Gillespie, Mr. and Mrs. David Wayne Grant, the Guilds of the Center Richard C. and Virginia A. Hansucker, Mr. Donald E. and Lacey Moriarty, Eugene and Run Ann Moriarty, Jean Moriarty, Richard A. and Marilyn Kayla Moriarty, Stephen and Susan Perry, Susan and Henry Samueli, Sally E. Segerstrom and Toby Andrews, Jennifer Anton Segerstrom, Elizabeth Henry T. Segerstrom, Hal and Jeanette Segerstrom Family Foundation, Henry T. and Renee Segerstrom, Ruth Segerstrom, Mr. and Mrs. Theodore W. Segerstrom, Mr. Torin H. Segerstrom, Veronica P. Segerstrom, Mrs. Yvonne Segerstrom, South Coast Plaza, Mrs. Richard Steele. Wow, that's a lot of Segerstroms in here. We've got Bank of America, B of A, Bank of America Foundation, Jane and Jim Driscoll, Steve and Cindy Fry, Fry Family Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, the Ralph Leatherby Foundation, General Mrs. William Leon, Harry and Grace Steele Foundation, Swenson Family Foundation. And we've got Anonymous 4 that don't want you to know who they are. They're very suspiciously anonymous. No, I'm just kidding. Bet and Willie Aitken, Ginger and Tony Allen, ZM Alred, Dean C. Alred, Carol Ann Alred Starr, Automobile Club of Southern California, Mr. and Mrs. James P. Baldwin. I wonder if they're related to the Baldwin with all the stuff that's going on with the shooting. The Beale family, Mrs. D. James Bentley, Mr. and Mrs. William J. Bettingen, Mr. and Mrs. Grant Bettingen, Marta and Raj Bethal, the Boeing Community Foundation, I guess if that's the one with the planes, Deborah and Larry J. Bridges, Broadway Across America, California Bank and Trust, Missy and Chris Cayero, Eileen J. Cirillo, Mrs. Mary Ellen Gonzalman, Cox Communication, Cox Media, lots of Cox, Sally and Randy Croquette, Delta Airlines, Benjamin and Carmela Dew, Edison International, Mr. and Mrs. Modi Furter, Lugano Diamonds, the First American Corporation, Fluor Corporation for the Fluor Foundation, Paul F. and Duran Folino, Leo Friedman Foundation, Patricia Friedrichs Dolson, Freedom Communications Inc., June M. Fry, John and Tony Ginger, Michael and Eleanor Gordon, Nora and Charles Hester, and the Hester Family Foundation, Lawrence and Dolores Higbee, George Hogue Family Foundation. I guess they have something to do with all the Hogues that are popping up everywhere here in Irvine, California, Woodbridge, and nearby areas. Mark and Christine Howlett, the Irvine Company, which we all know and love, the Irvine Company. Mark Chapin Johnson, W.M. Keck Foundation, Kia Motors America, Inc., Roger and Tracy Kerwin, Kling Family Foundation, Margaret G. and Thomas E. Larkin, Corey and Leslie Layton, Sharon D. Lund Foundation, Times Mirror Foundation, and Los Angeles Times. Philip N. and Mary A. Leons, Mrs. Colleen Manchester, Paul and Lily Mirage, Mercedes-Benz USA, David and Kareth Moore, Mrs. Mary and Moore, Rick Muth Family Orco Block, Pam and Jim Muzzy, Dr. Henry Nicholas III, Mrs. Stacy Nicholas, Mr. and Mrs. Frank E. O'Brien, Pacific Life. Bill and Pat Podlick, Mrs. Marjorie Tay Rollins, Mr. and Mrs. William Roberts, Michelle Rohi, Rutan and Tucker LLP. The Samueli Foundation, Mr. and Mrs. George Schrager. The Segerstrom Foundation, Mrs. Donna Shannon, Mr. and Mrs. Ron Simon, Mr. and Mrs. Douglas H. Smith, the Somerville Trust, Spectrum Reach, Georgia Hull Spooner, Dorothy Stillwell, Tara and David Trube, Union Bank, Elizabeth Collier, Vincent Eugene, and Tim Weiss. Wells Fargo Bank, Wells Fargo Foundation, Mrs. Constance T. Whitney, Cecil C. and Catherine H. Wright. This is not even half of all the people who have funded the Segerstrom. We've got more anonymous than we've got Howard and Roberta A. Manson, Mr. and Mrs. Richard D. Allen, the Algren Foundation, Doug and Jamie Baker, Dr. and Mrs. Arnold Orr Beckman, Mr. and Mrs. Benton Bijak, excuse my humanity, Dr. Fran and Charlie Kacha, Cartier, David and Victoria Collins, Mary and Richard Kramer, James and Catherine Emmy, Andy and Joan Filmiano, Carol, Robert and Folan, Carol Frobish, Harriet F. Grant, Rondell B. and Joyce P. Hansen, Marilou and Jerry Harrington, Clifford S. Hines, S.L. and Betty Huang, Huang Family Foundation, J.P. Morgan Chase, J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation, Barbara and Robert Kleist, Curtis A. and Varla E. N. Knaus, Robert or Knaus, I don't know, depending whether you pronounce the K or not, I don't know. Robert D. and Patricia B. McDonald's. So I guess the McDonald's are in here. Oh, McDonald made a burger. Dr. and Mrs. Randall R. McCardle, Marcia L. Millen in memory of James and Leith Millen, Mrs. Mary M. Muth, Nordstrom, it's here in South Coast Plaza. There's got many Nordstroms around here. The Peter Ox family, Trish and John O'Donnell, Mr. John E. Pope and Mrs. Jackie Singer, Charles and Patricia Poss, Ralph's Food for Less, the Renhold Foundation, Rockwell International, Carlene Rona, Eve and Michael J. Rufato, Bev and Bob Sendelman, Carolyn and Joseph Schukert, Nick and Heidi Sharistani, the Shanbrom family, Mr. and Mrs. Peter Owen Shea Holmes Foundation, Janice and Ted Smith, Justice Sheila Prail, Sunshine Rhett, and Mr. Yagal Sunshine, David and Diana Steffi, Susan M. and Timothy L. Strader family, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph M. Thomas, and Mr. and Mrs. William Thompson, Thomas and Elizabeth Tierney, Thomas and Joyce Tucker family, Valiant Pharmaceuticals, Mr. and Mrs. Robert P. Wormington, Janine and Dave Warner, Carol and Kent Wilkin. I crap you not, that's just one of the many pages of donors. So donors, Center Fund. The Center Fund provides general operating support on an annual basis for Segerstrom Center for the Arts and its programs. We are honored to recognize the following individuals, corporations, and foundations for their gifts between July 1st, 2021 and June 30, 2022. That doesn't even cover what's going on in 2023. Your generosity makes a difference every day, and we thank you. To learn more about the Center Fund and the benefits of giving and receiving and giving and more receiving, please contact Malika Middlebrooks at mmiddlebrooks@scfund.org. or I'm not going to say the number because I don't want to get in trouble, but just use the email. It's probably fine. Anyway, there's more anonymous. Okay, I'm not making it up. Look, it says anonymous, like the Muppets. Anyway, Philip N. and Mary A. Leons, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Meyer, Elizabeth and Henry T. Segerstrom. Julia and George Agronos comes back again, once again. Agronos Families Foundation. Gloria Brandis, Kevin and Denise Cassin, Eugene and Ruth N. Moriarty, Sandy Segerstrom Daniels. I think a lot of these actually are repeats from the previous one. I do remember some of these. More anonymous. Marta and Raj Bethal, Deborah and Larry J. Bridges, Center Tower Associates, Chase McCollin, Anne Conway family, Jane and Jim Driscoll, Kling Family Foundation, Jackie Glass. Jeez, sorry about that. Jenny and Jeff Gross, Mr. and Mrs. Hans Emoff, Paul and Lily Mirage, Chipotle Mexican Grill. This was not in the previous ones. Jennifer and Brian Nicole, Bill and Pat Podelich, Michelle Roshi, Michael and Stacy Schlinger, Mr. and Mrs. George Schreier, David and Diane Steffi, Howard and Roberta Amson, Ginger and Tony Allen, Catherine and Howard Bland, Sally and Randy Croquette, Dior again, Mr. and Mrs. Andy Fimiano, John and Tony Ginger, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Hales, Lawrence and Dolores Higby, SL and Betty Huang. Huang Family Foundation is here again. Barbara Hiller Johnson, Bert and Molly Jolly, Don and Sugi Kong, Roger and Tracy Kerwan, Carla Kraft and Andy Beringen, Dale Landon and Carol Hayes Landon, Louis Vuitton. Oh, look. And even with nothing on, I still made you look with my ankle face. Anyway, Dr. and Mrs. Randall R. McCardle, Rick Muth family, Orko Block, Lana, Walter Persadian, Reverend and Mrs. Stephen Perry, John and Sherry Flan, David and Molly Pote Foundation, Elizabeth and Justice Schlitting, Mr. and Mrs. Theodore W. Segerstrom, Sally and E. Segerstrom, Sharon D. Lund Foundation, Rana and Bill Shipman, Connie and Dr. Peter Spenuzza. Who knew there were so many Italians in this thing? Anyway, Stuart R. Smith and Robin and Ferracone, Stephen M. Sorensen, MD, Susan M. and Timothy L. Strader family, Tammy and Samuel Tang, the Tapan Foundation, the Guilds of the Center, Tara and David Trube, Janine and Dave Warner, Carol and Kent Wilkin, Charles and Ling Zhang. Anyway, I think Kent Wilkin showed up twice in this thing already. Dr. and Mrs. Bartley Asner, Stephen and Herma Brene, Eileen J. Cirillo, I'm not sure, Mary and Richard Kramer, Bonnie and Paul Lubbock, Neil and Barbara Philip Trust, Chuck and Jill Schreiber, Honorable H. Warren and Janet Siegel, Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Vanderhook, Wilfred M. and Janet A. Roof Foundation. We've got Elizabeth and Gordon Clune, Mr. and Mrs. Eyal Aronoff, Alfred E. Baldwin, that's the Baldwins again, the BL family, Bobby Cox, Benjamin and Carmela Dew, Alan and Sandy Feinbarg, Diane and Joyce Fruit, Goal Foundation, Mary Lou and Jerry Harrington, Mike and Lynn Joseph, Donna L. Kendall Foundation, Harmon and Lee Kong, Deborah H. and Jeffrey H. Margolis, Marcia L. Millen in memory of James and Lethan Millen, Mr. and Mrs. Keith Murray, Mr. Maurice Murray, Caroline Zarate, Ramsey and Robert Ramsey, Mary and Carl Raymond, Mr. Christy A. Rosen, Bevan Bob Sandelman, Justice Sheila Priel Sonnenschein, and Mr. Yigal Sonnenschein, Mrs. Valerie Wollner. Again, this is not even half of the people. We've got more anonymous: Tom and Pam Bender, Tony and Stephen Berlinger, Barbara and Alex Bowie. The Bowie or Bowie, anyway. The Cameron Family Foundation, Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence D. Cancellieri, Mary and John Carrington, Jeanette L. Curci, Dr. and Mrs. David Eggleston, Mr. and Mrs. David Ems, the second, Mr. and Mrs. Jeff Estabrooks, Doug and Julie Garn. Wow, that's a handful, isn't it? Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Grody, Marlene and Sam Hammondtree, Kim and Scott Harris Wiener, Gavin and Ninetta Herbert, Reza Jahangiri, and Mrs. Katie Levering Jahangiri, Jessica and James Johnson, Mary Phillip and David Johnson, Mr. and Mrs. Jeremy M. Jones, Mr. and Mrs. Bruce W. Koulouris, Corey and Leslie Layton, Mr. and Mrs. C. Ronald Livingston, Douglas Tad, Lori and Gail Lori, Charles and Twyla Martin, Mr. John Massa and Mrs. Lisa Argyros, Rebecca and Carl McLaren, Louise Mirage, Pam and Jim Muzzy, Mr. John R. Patterson, Patricia Poss, Mr. James P. Praviti, and Miss Bobby K. Howie, Susan and Henry Samueli, Melinda and Stephen Sanders, Mr. and Mrs. Bert Selva, Mr. and Mrs. Ron Simon, Catherine Smith, the Somerville Trust, Mindy and Glenn Stearns, Dr. and Mrs. Charles Steinman, Sue and Ralph Stern, Stephanie and Corey Suckert, Donna and Ray Thagard Jr., Amy and Jeffrey Veith, Stacy and Paul Von Berg. There's more anonymous too here. Dr. Fernando H. Austin, Mr. and Mrs. James R. Bergman, Canterbury Consulting. Wow, so Canterbury, I used to go to university there, Canterbury, Kent, but I'm not sure if that has anything to do because there's probably a Canterbury, Kent in America too. But Canterbury Consulting, interesting. Mr. D. Robinson Cluck, Mrs. Barbara Klein, Gunnell Cole, Mr. and Mrs. W. James Edwards III, Robert and Ladorna Eichenberg, Mrs. Loop Irwin, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Francis, Mr. Stan Frome, Mr. and Mrs. John C. Garrett, Howard Glacier, Damon Chen, Mr. and Mrs. Krager Grosvenor, Mrs. Vicky Gum, Rondo B. and Joyce P. Hansen, Gary and Rob Johnson, Keller Family Fund, Robert D. and Patricia B. McDonald, Haiti and Carlos Amalura, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Moorhead, Scott and Jasmine Morielli, Patrick E. Patton and S. Leslie Jewett, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Perry, Mr. and Mrs. Vincent Pozzuoli, Hillary Roberts and Gregory Weath, RT Specialty. Wow, that was a lot of donors, but don't worry. There's only about 1, 2, 3, 4 more pages, 5 with the center staff. So we won't get to all of them today, but there's going to be more. So don't worry if your name wasn't called out yet. It might still come up tomorrow. Oh boy. Reindeers are better than people. Sven, would you think that's true? Anyway. Fun stuff. Anyway, do you want to build a snowman? Or do you need to let it go? Because sometimes you just gotta let it go. You just do. You just gotta let it go. It's okay. It's okay to let it go. It's not your fault if you let it go. It is sometimes your fault, but sometimes it's not your fault. But if you let it go in a public place, they might consider that it is your fault. So don't let it go in the public arena. Anyway. We're back. The pesky, conniving son of a gun is back, reminding you that this morning he was teaching his. How does it go? He was teaching the truth in love, telling it like it is, while holding pure motives and showing that he cared. He was teaching the truth in love. Events. We do have those events in intentional robots. So let's dive into this a couple minutes. Not very long, just a couple of minutes. Because after all, it took me 30 minutes to read a couple of pages of names. Donors. Anyway, anybody, I don't have my box today, but it's okay. You don't need a box. If you want to reach into the screen and drop some money right here, I'll accept PayPal donations to CG Trader and Experts Column, I think. The problem is I recently went into Experts Column and I don't see a lot of the stuff that I made back in the day. I'm not sure what's going on. Do they have new policies? Is something going on that I didn't know about? Because recently they've changed some stuff. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, so you can always rely on that beautiful CG Trader, but other companies got new tricks up their sleeves. So we have to see if Expert Column is still going to be a viable source of monetization or not. We'll see. It's so hard these days. It's so hard to prove you exist. Anyway, so yeah, events. One of the criteria is to be satisfied is the capability of producing the familiar world of everyday experience. This criterion is not fulfilled by an extensional ontology. We claimed that the world is composed of onfiends. In the following, we will show how an onfiend produces events and how in turn events are the foundation of objects and subjects. What is an event? Here, the concept of event is somewhat different from the classic definition according to which an event is the instantiation of some property by some particulars at a certain instantaneous time. An event is defined as something without which he or the actual state of universe would have been different. No constraints are posed on what an event can be. For example, an event can be the modification of the energetic level of an electron on the declaration of war between two countries. Hint. Are there two countries at the brink of war or still at war? I don't know. It can be the melting of a glacier which lasts for several millennia, or the blink of an eye. An event can be something physical like a stone falling, or subjective like a sharp pain, not its cause but the phenomenal pain itself. In short, an event has no constraints, either spatial or temporal. An event can be subjective or objective, or simply physical. An event is just something without which reality would have been different. Obviously, if something had no effects on reality, it would not even exist. Or would it? Again, this is what I was talking about before. What happens when you do something within an alternate reality that still exists right now? For instance, am I really doing something if I'm doing something right here in Irvine, California, Woodbridge, and somebody watches what is happening over here somewhere else? Did what is happening over here actually happen if it did not cause any consequence to someone else somewhere else? That is a good question to ask yourself. In a sense, there is a strong relationship between an event and simply a thing, an ens, which is something that simply exists. Being an event is a condition of existence. It is impossible to be in any meaningful sense without being an event too. So it's saying that we are events? Okay. It is impossible to divide the property of being from the property of being an event, which is something that provokes effects on the rest of the world. Things are thus derived from events. Further, these last considerations take us to the natural conclusion that being is being in relation with. In short, we propose that an event is everything whose absence would make a difference to what reality is, e.h. It is important to stress that such a definition is independent of most ontological commitments. It is independent of the kind of difference that it constitutes. Besides, the definition captures the essence of REH as well as ERH. REH states that any representation must be an event in order to be different from the null event. ERH states that in order to be an event, it must be in virtue of its being in relation with something. It must make a difference. Furthermore, that being a relation and being an event must be seen as two sides of the same object. There cannot be an event by itself and an object in itself. The classical definition of pneumic object is thus rejected at its very root. If ERH is accepted, there are no more things in themselves. On the other hand, if REH is accepted, the two separate domains for mental entities or symbolic construction of interpretation or whatever, and for reality in itself no longer exist. An event is therefore similar to what is traditionally seen as the causal relation that links two separate events. The difference is that the event is not a pure relation, but it is embodied in the occurring enfines. Once one accepts that the relation between each events carries the ontological weight, the need to propose or suppose the existence of a class of substances disappears. The other immediate logical effect of this rationale is that each relation between events must necessarily be seen both as an event in itself and as unity. The first consequence derives from the fact that every relation is, from every conceivable point of view, something which has happened and that can be considered as an event. This is little more than a tautology of ERH. The second consequence comes from the empirical and observed fact that the world contains unities and that such unities must be substantiated at a non-reductionistic level. It also says that, for example, it does not entail that the difference should be a physical or mental or a subjective or an objective one. In this sense, it is possible to claim that a definition like EH is independent of the subjective-objective dichotomy, and as such, it can be used to set a more fundamental framework. So many pages. Causation. We'll get into causation real quick. An intentional relation is something that is simultaneously a condition for existence and conditions for knowledge. Can we somehow locate an intentional relation in our everyday experience of reality? This is indeed possible, albeit with a few distinctions in the way we do it. We will enter into the details of the epistemic processes in 6.3. Here, we want to deal with the similarities with regards to the more familiar causal relation. An enfine leaves something in the world. An affine or intentional relation leaves a causal relationship between two events. In other words, causation is the perceived intentional relation between two basic events. Causation should not be intended as the controversial relationship binding two events in general, but simply as the posteriori necessary relationship that can be logically assumed to have existed between them. After two events have taken place, if the second was somehow dependent on the first, it is not arbitrary to say that if the first one had not existed, the second one would have not existed either. As Hume stated, we will never be completely sure that events of the same kind as the first event can lead to events of the same kind as the second one in the future. Yet, a causal relation can be supposed in the past, suppose not ascertained. If a causal relation cannot be detected, it seems uncontroversial that, given whatever set of events, there has been other events in the past that were conditional to the first set. In short, the causal relation as defined above is the fossil of the intentional relation. It states that something has linked two otherwise separate events. It is possible, however, to observe the provoked effects of the relation or the intentional relation as if it was an event. Causal relations are what have linked two events, and it does not matter if they are perceived as such. Two remarks are possible. The first is that it is possible to look at an intentional relation from the outside and from the inside. In the former case, what is perceived is just a causal relation between two events, each one perceived along a separate intentional pathway leading from it to our inner mental states. In the latter case, the world is perceived as it is in our usual manner. The subject is literally the intentional relation, and what the subject perceives is the content carried by it. The second consideration is that it is not possible to observe an intentional relation directly except in the most intimate possible way, by being that intentional relation. Intentional relations carry contents, and there is no need to suppose any other explanation framework. A first consequence of this argument is the fact that if an event were completely deprived of intentional relations with other events, it would literally disappear from the universe. Or better, it would not disappear, because in that case it would have some effects on some parts of reality. For example, the effects of his disappearance. This argument is similar to Armstrong's causal relevancy criterion. This apparently obvious result can be used in order to state a not so obvious remark, that every event has to be connected with other events, and that no event exists by itself. The being of an object resides in its relation connections with the rest of the world. The idea of atoms closed like monads loses its apparent simplicity. This brings us to the logical conclusion that affines or intentional relations alone are sufficient to explain the world without having to resort to events. Events can be described in terms of intentional relations only, and as such they are considered as nothing more than explanatory means. If the previous rationale can be accepted, then normal objects can be seen as useful simplifications of more complicated sets of events, while events themselves derive from intentional relations. It is tempting to remove the logical necessity of something among causal relations. It is possible to imagine a world of pure causal relations. Such a world is attractive, but presents several problems of its own. It completely lacks the ability of producing content as well as quality. In a world of pure causal relations, it is impossible to explain where meaning and quality originate from. In this world, everything would be reduced to the lowest ontological level of entities manifested by a pure extensional world. In the following, we will show how it is possible to describe a world of pure intentional relations. Causation is an obvious candidate for the intentional relation. Unfortunately, the causal relation, at least in its modern formulation, a law stipulating occurrence of phonema, has been subjected to two main streams of criticism. The first is that the famous analysis Hume gave to the classical principle of causality. The second derives from more recent conception of the world that seems to remove any need of causing or using causation is an elementary component of reality. To overcome in one single step both sources of criticism, a different definition of causation is here proposed. Instead of trying to define causation as a type of theory, something that must be valid for types, a token theory of causation will be proposed. In short, it is possible to say that there has been a causal relation between two events in which one of the two would not have been without the first one. Causation becomes the unavoidable legacy of the past to the present. Besides, there are no constraints on the number of involved events. An event can be dependent on more than just one other event. For example, event A can be dependent on event B and also an event C. In our usage of term, the previous sentence means only that A could not have existed without existence of B and C. There is no limitation of principle on the number of the antecedent events. In short, for each event occurring somewhere and sometimes, there is a set of past events without which the original event would not have existed. Ooh, that was a lot. That was a lot, guys. That was a lot indeed. Let's see if we can... Maybe we'll just finish this last page bit. And that'll be all for today. It has been 47 minutes of me. Well, it's actually really only been, maybe 20 minutes of me reading this book. So let's finish this bit. It is interesting to note that the bulk of criticism has been directed towards causation as a law connecting occurrence phenomena and not towards causation as a cause giving the essence of being the internal principle of its effect. Curiosity, it happened when Descartes and its contemporaries introduced mechanism as universal explanatory framework of nature, for nature. Causation stripped of its ontological prerogatives would not be adequately endorsed by natural laws. The presumed inutility of causation in modern physics related more with this second kind of causation than the former one. The question of Aristotle's theory of causation is really unused in physics, should be, as far as we know, further investigated. This definition is similarly to the classic definition of causation as the process by which an entity, the cause, determines the existence of another entity, the effect. It is possible to compare our definition with St. Thomas quod potest esse et non esse indiget aliquo agent ad hoc quod sit sine quo rimanet non ens. Anyway, it's a bunch of Latin terms. It's a dead language. Everything that could be or not be depends for its existence by another entity without which it could not be. I don't know if that's correct. My mom knows Latin, so she'd be able to tell you whether that's right or not. I can't tell you any of that. Cum ad rom, the heck? Anyway. And then it goes on to say, ex hoc quod aliquid est ens per participationem sequitur quod sit causatum ab alio, which apparently means everything that exists, it exists because it received its existence from something else. In short, in medieval philosophy, the concept of cause is reduced to the concept of ends. which gives the principle of existence to another ends, as well as the concept of effect is reduced to the concept of ends that receive such a principle from another ends. Wow, there's a lot of ends. Ends keep giving to ends. There's a lot of giving and receiving and all that good stuff, so that new ends can be born. By admitting this, by admitting that such a set of past events could be empty, there is space also for microphysical quantum mechanical events with no legacy with the past. Let's admit that a couple of particles and antiparticles could spring out of nothing. That event would simply be an event with an empty set of antecedents. Nevertheless, the fact that it is possible for some event to have no relations with the past does not entail that all events happen independently of the past. And so with that, guys, that is enough for today, because the light is about to end. And when the light ends, your eyes start to struggle with things. Not my eyes. My eyes are fine in the dark. A bit of a kitten when it comes to that. That doesn't mean just because you can, you should, right? So we are going to leave it there because it's getting late. But anyway, thanks again for joining me on another adventure with Frozen. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell me in the hate in the comments that I don't bring the Disney magic to the channel, because I do. The doodly doo that I do. And with that, I welcome you. I welcome you to reach through the screen and drop a couple of cents onto this beautiful fan that I received in New York from a beautiful woman at a what was it? Probably a Marriott hotel, and she was kind enough to give us a bunch of these, and it was awesome. So thank you. You know who you are. You'll probably never see this video because the algorithm will never let you see this video, but if you did see this video, I thank you. And again, if you are left and you want to put in a couple of cents for the divorce fund, or you are right, hot-blooded, male or female, and want to put a couple of cents in the Be Your Own Man fund, or you want to, as a hater, you want to stick throw a couple of cents in the fund for binge hate watching, or if you're just a fan and you want to, which probably there aren't any, but anyway, I'm just putting it out there. If there is, by accident, out of serendipity, a fan who wants to throw in a couple of cents in the PayPal or the CG Trader, just reach in through the screen and throw a couple of PayPal dollars right here on this beautiful fan. Anyway, with that said, I'm a fan myself. I'm a fan myself a little bit. It's one of those things that people do. It's the perpetual motion machine that can only be perpetual until I get tired, and then it won't be perpetual anymore. Anyway, so thanks guys for watching, for participating. All 1 million of you guys, thank you for always participating and helping out with the channel. And for now, I will say bye for now.